While Omari's family laughed and his mistress poured wine, he shoved divorce papers at Diane during Thanksgiving dinner. They mocked her silence. They celebrated her humiliation. But the mansion, the land, the empire they sat in, it all belonged to her now. $88 billion. And she hadn't spoken one word. The dining room was too big for the warmth it was supposed to hold. The table stretched long enough to seat 20 people, but tonight only 8 sat around it. Diane sat at one end, quiet as always, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, Omari's family filled the space with noise, laughter that didn't reach anyone's heart, jokes that cut like knives wrapped in silk. Omari's mother, Gloria, sat near the center of the table like a queen holding court. She wore gold everywhere, gold earrings that caught the light, gold bracelets that clinked when she moved her hands, gold rings on almost every finger. She was loud, the kind of loud that demanded attention, that filled every silence before it could settle. She laughed at her own jokes and expected everyone else to laugh too. Tonight she was going on and on about her son, about how successful he was, about how he built an empire from nothing, about how proud she was to call him hers. Renee, Omari's sister, sat beside her mother, nodding along like a puppet on strings. Renee was younger than Omari by 3 years, but she carried herself like she was born entitled to everything. She wore designer clothes and made sure everyone knew it. Her nails were done. Her hair was done. Everything about her screamed money. She kept glancing at Diane with this look, this mixture of pity and disgust, like Diane was something unfortunate that happened to their family, something they tolerated but never truly accepted. And then there was Shanice, Omari's mistress. She sat right beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She poured his wine without being asked. She laughed at everything he said. She touched his arm when she spoke. And nobody at that table pretended it was strange. Nobody questioned why she was there. They treated her like she belonged, like she was already family, like Diane was the outsider in her own home. Diane wore a simple dress, nothing fancy. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun. She wore no jewelry except for a small golden locket around her neck. It was old, worn, the kind of thing that carried memories instead of value. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken much all evening. She just sat there, watching, listening, existing in a space that no longer felt like hers. The food was expensive, catered, the kind of Thanksgiving spread that cost thousands of dollars. Turkey with herb butter, honey-glazed ham, truffle macaroni and cheese, lobster tails, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. It was excessive. It was loud. It was everything Diane never wanted but somehow ended up with. Omari sat at the opposite end of the table from Diane. He looked good. He always looked good. Expensive suit, fresh haircut, gold watch that caught the light the same way his mother's jewelry did. He'd been drinking, not too much, just enough to make him bold, just enough to make him feel untouchable. He looked at Diane, and there was nothing in his eyes. No love, no regret, not even anger, just indifference, the kind that hurts worse than hate. Gloria raised her glass, and everyone followed. She was making a toast, something about family, something about blessings, something about how far they'd all come. Diane didn't raise her glass. Nobody noticed. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. When Gloria finished, everyone clinked glasses and drank. Everyone except Diane. That's when Omari stood up. The table went quiet. All eyes turned to him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. Crisp, white, official-looking. He walked slowly down the length of the table. His shoes clicked against the marble floor. Click, click, click. Each step felt like a countdown. When he reached Diane, he didn't sit. He just stood there, looking down at her like she was beneath him, like she always had been. He dropped the folder in front of her. It landed with a soft thud. Divorce papers. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Omari's voice came out cold, flat, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. "Sign it," he said. "You've been nothing but dead weight. Shanice is everything you're not." Gloria clapped. Actually clapped, like her son had just done something worthy of applause. Renee laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the walls. Shanice smirked. She leaned back in her chair and sipped her champagne, watching Diane like she was watching a show, like this was entertainment. Diane stared at the folder. She didn't open it. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't defend herself. She just sat there, silent, her hands still folded in her lap. The locket around her neck caught the light for just a second, a small glint of gold in all that cold. Someone at the table said something about how Diane never appreciated what she had. Someone else said she never contributed anything. Another voice said she was lucky Omari stuck around as long as he did. The words piled on top of each other, an avalanche of cruelty disguised as honesty. They talked about her like she wasn't there, like she was already gone. Omari leaned down close to her ear. His voice was a whisper meant only for her, but loud enough for the table to catch pieces of. "You've always been invisible, Diane. Might as well make it official." He straightened up, gestured to the papers. "Sign it and disappear. Do us all a favor." Diane's hand moved slowly. She reached for the pen that Omari had placed beside the folder, her fingers wrapped around it. The room held its breath. Even the people who hated her wanted to see how this would end. She opened the folder. The papers were thick. Legal language she didn't bother reading. She knew what they said. She flipped to the last page where the signature line waited, and then she signed. Her handwriting was neat, controlled. She didn't hesitate. She just wrote her name and put the pen down. Omari grabbed the papers before the ink could dry. He kissed Shanice right there, right in front of Diane, right in front of everyone, and the table erupted. Cheers, laughter, more clinking of glasses. They celebrated like they'd just won something, like they'd just freed themselves from a burden they'd carried too long. Diane stood up, slowly, quietly. She pushed her chair back and it didn't make a sound. She walked toward the door and nobody stopped her. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody said thank you for the meal, for the home, for the years. They just let her go, let her fade into the background like she always did. The last thing she heard before she left the room was Shanice's voice, high, excited, talking about redecorating, talking about making this place hers. But here's what they didn't know, what none of them could have known. The mansion they sat in, the land it stood on, the cars in the driveway, the furniture they lounged on, the very walls that held their laughter. It all belonged to Diane, every single piece. And in her pocket was a letter that had arrived that morning, a letter that told her she'd just inherited $88 billion. $88 billion, an empire, a legacy, a fortune so vast it could buy and sell families like Omari's 100 times over. And she hadn't told a soul. She'd kept it quiet, just like she kept everything quiet, because silence, as her grandmother used to say, was strength. And Diane was about to show them just how strong silence could be. 30 years earlier, Diane was a different kind of quiet. She grew up in a small southern town where everybody knew everybody. The kind of place where people still sat on porches in the evening and waved at strangers, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, where respect was taught before reading. Diane lived with her grandmother, Miss Lorraine, in a house that was small but full of love, the kind of love that didn't need much to feel like everything. Miss Lorraine raised Diane alone after Diane's parents died in a car accident. Diane was only 4 when it happened, too young to understand death but old enough to feel the absence. Miss Lorraine worked as a domestic worker. She cleaned houses for white families on the other side of town. She ironed their clothes. She cooked their meals. She raised their children while her own granddaughter waited for her to come home. The work was hard. The pay was small. But Miss Lorraine never complained. She came home every evening with tired feet and a smile that never quit. She taught Diane everything that mattered: how to pray, how to cook, how to sew a button back on when it fell off, how to save money even when there wasn't much to save. But most importantly, she taught Diane how to be silent in a world that tried to make you small. "Silence is strength, baby," Miss Lorraine would say. "Let God fight your battles. You just keep your head down and your heart clean." Diane was a gentle child, soft-spoken, kind. The other kids at school used to tease her, called her too quiet, too boring, too country. She never fought back, never raised her voice. She just smiled and kept walking. Miss Lorraine would hold her at night when the tears came, would rock her and hum old hymns until Diane fell asleep. "They don't understand you yet, baby," she'd whisper, "but one day they will. Quiet people see things loud people miss. Remember that." When Diane turned 16, Miss Lorraine gave her a golden locket. It was small, delicate. The clasp was a little loose and the gold had faded in some spots, but it was the most beautiful thing Diane had ever seen. Inside was a tiny picture of Miss Lorraine when she was young, smiling, bright-eyed, full of dreams. "This holds my love," Miss Lorraine said as she clasped it around Diane's neck. "Wear it when the world gets heavy, when people make you feel small, when you forget who you are. Touch this and remember you come from strength." Diane wore that locket every single day, through high school, through college, through everything that came after. It became a part of her, a reminder that she wasn't alone even when she felt invisible. Diane worked hard, 3 jobs while she was in college. She waited tables in the morning, worked at a library in the afternoon, cleaned office buildings at night. She sent money home to Miss Lorraine every month, saved the rest, never spent on things she didn't need. She graduated with honors, got a degree in business and finance, got a good job at a firm in the city. She was the first person in her family to finish college. Miss Lorraine cried the day Diane walked across that stage, cried tears of pride and joy and relief. That same year, Diane met Omari. He was charming, the kind of man who knew how to talk, who knew how to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. He came from a loud family, the kind that threw big parties and drove expensive cars and acted like the world owed them something. But when it was just him and Diane, he was different, softer. He told her about his dreams, about wanting to build something, about wanting to be someone. And Diane believed him. She believed in him. She thought she saw something real underneath all that flash. They got married young, small ceremony, just family and a few friends. Miss Lorraine was there. She held Diane's hand before she walked down the aisle. "You sure about this, baby?" she asked. Diane nodded. "I love him, Grandma." Miss Lorraine squeezed her hand. "Then I'm happy for you. But don't ever forget who you are. Don't ever let anybody dim your light." The early years were good. Omari was building his business, real estate, property development, big ideas that needed big money. Diane supported him. She worked her job, paid the bills, saved every dollar. When Omari's business failed the first time, Diane didn't complain. She just worked harder. When it failed the second time, she took out a loan, put her name on the line, believed in him when nobody else did. Somewhere along the way, things changed. Omari's family started coming around more, started giving opinions about everything, about how Diane dressed, how she talked, how she didn't fit into their world. Gloria would make comments, little digs disguised as concern. "Diane, honey, don't you think you should try a little harder with your appearance?" Or maybe if you were more social, Omari wouldn't have to go to events alone. Renee was worse. She didn't disguise anything. She just said what she thought, called Diane boring, called her plain, called her a charity case that Omari should have never married. Omari started staying out late, started coming home smelling like perfume that wasn't Diane's, started looking at her like she was a burden he didn't ask for, and Diane, true to everything Miss Lorraine taught her, stayed silent. She didn't fight, didn't yell, didn't demand answers. She just kept being who she was, kept working, kept believing that love would find its way back. Miss Lorraine passed away 3 years into Diane's marriage, peacefully in her sleep. Diane held the locket at the funeral and didn't let go. It was the only piece of her grandmother she had left, the only thing that still felt like home. The weeks leading up to that Thanksgiving dinner were the hardest of Diane's life. She'd known about Shanice for months, had seen the signs, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way Omari looked at her with nothing in his eyes. She'd driven past Shanice's office once, saw them together through the glass window, saw the way Shanice touched his arm, the way he smiled at her, the way he never smiled at Diane anymore. She didn't confront him, didn't scream or throw things or demand he choose. She just watched her marriage die in slow motion, watched the man she loved turn into a stranger. Omari started bringing Shanice around, introduced her as his business partner, his colleague, his associate. But everyone knew. Gloria knew, Renee knew, their friends knew, and they all acted like it was fine, like it was normal, like Diane was the problem for not just accepting it and moving on. Gloria started inviting Shanice to family dinners, started treating her like a daughter, started asking her opinion on things, started acting like Diane wasn't even there. Renee was even worse. She'd pull Shanice aside and they'd whisper, they'd laugh, they'd look at Diane and roll their eyes. One night, Diane overheard them in the kitchen. "Once he finally divorces her, we can breathe again," Renee said. "I know," Shanice replied. "I'm already looking at furniture for this place. Gonna make it actually look good." They laughed. Diane stood on the other side of the door, her hand on the locket, and said nothing. The mansion they lived in had been purchased 8 years ago. Omari thought it was his, talked about it like he built it, like he earned it. But the truth was, the deed was in Diane's name, under her LLC. She'd set it up that way because Omari's credit was bad. His business ventures kept failing. His name was poison to banks. So Diane put her name on everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. She did it quietly, without making a big deal, without asking for credit. She just did what needed to be done. And Omari never even noticed. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, plain white envelope, law firm return address. Diane almost threw it away, thinking it was junk mail. But something made her open it. Inside was a letter from a lawyer named Mr. Holloway. It was about her grandmother's brother, a man Diane had never met, a man Miss Lorraine never talked about. Apparently he'd left the family decades ago, built a business empire, factories, real estate, offshore holdings, investments. He'd died with no children, no wife, no close family, just a will. And in that will, he left everything to his only living relative, Diane. $88 billion. That's what the letter said. Diane read it 3 times, then 4, then 5. She sat on her bed, holding the paper with shaking hands, and couldn't breathe. It didn't feel real, couldn't be real, but the letter was official. The law firm was real, the numbers were real. She called the number at the bottom of the letter, spoke to Mr. Holloway. He confirmed everything, explained the details, the assets, the process, the timeline. It was real, all of it. Diane hung up the phone and sat in silence for an hour. She touched the locket, thought about Miss Lorraine, thought about all those years of cleaning other people's houses, all those years of being invisible, All those years of teaching Diane that quiet strength was the only strength that mattered. And now, sitting in a mansion that she owned but never claimed, holding a letter that made her one of the richest women in the country, Diane understood. She finally understood what her grandmother meant. She didn't tell Omari, didn't tell anyone. She just went about her days like nothing had changed. She watched Omari and Shanice, watched Gloria and Renee, watched them plan and scheme and celebrate a future that didn't include her. And she stayed quiet, made her phone calls in private, spoke to lawyers, signed papers, set things in motion, and waited. When Omari told her about the Thanksgiving dinner, she said yes. When he told her his whole family was coming, she said okay. When he told her Shanice would be there, she didn't even flinch. She just nodded, because Diane had learned something in those weeks, something powerful, something dangerous. She'd learned that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was patience. It was power. The night before Thanksgiving, Diane couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the next day, thinking about what was coming. She knew what Omari was planning, knew he was going to humiliate her, knew he was going to make a show of it. And she was going to let him, because sometimes you have to let people dig their own graves. Sometimes you have to let them think they've won. And then, when they're celebrating, when they're drunk on their own arrogance, that's when you show them who you really are. The day after Thanksgiving, Omari woke up feeling like a king. He'd done it. Finally ended things with Diane. Finally made it official. Shanice had stayed over. They'd celebrated, drank expensive wine, made plans for the future. Gloria had called that morning, gushing about how proud she was. Renee had sent a text with champagne emojis. Everything felt right. Everything felt like it was finally falling into place. Then the letter came. Delivered by courier. Official looking. Legal. It was addressed to Omari and his family. A mandatory appearance at a property title hearing. Omari read it twice. Didn't understand. Why would there be a hearing about his properties? Everything was fine. Everything was in order. He called his lawyer. His lawyer said he should probably attend, that it was likely routine, nothing to worry about. Omari told his family, told them to come with him, make it a family thing. Gloria and Renee agreed. Shanice wanted to come too. I should be there, she said. I mean, I'm going to be living in that house soon anyway. Omari agreed, brought her along. They all showed up to the law office on Monday morning dressed like they were going to brunch. Casual, confident, unbothered. The lawyer's office was nice, not fancy but professional. Wood paneling, leather chairs, bookshelves full of law books that probably nobody ever read. Mr. Holloway greeted them at the door. He was an older black man, gray hair, kind eyes, calm demeanor. He shook everyone's hand and invited them to sit. The conference table was big, too big for the number of people there. Omari sat at the head of it like it was his throne. Gloria and Renee sat on one side. Shanice sat beside Omari, her hand on his leg, already acting like she belonged. And then Diane walked in. She was the last to arrive. She wore a black suit, tailored, expensive. Her hair was down, styled. She wore makeup, not too much, but enough. She looked different, carried herself different. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, something sharp, something that made the room go quiet when she entered. Omari's mouth fell open. "What are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, annoyed, confused. Diane didn't answer. She just sat down, across from him, her hands folded on the table, the locket still around her neck. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. We're here today to settle some ownership disputes regarding the estate at 4720 Maple Crest." That was the address of the mansion. Omari's mansion. At least, that's what he thought. Gloria leaned forward. "I'm sorry. Disputes? That's my son's house. Why would there be any disputes?" Mr. Holloway pulled out a folder, thick, full of documents. Actually, Mrs. Gloria, the property is titled under Diane's LLC, has been for 8 years. He slid copies of the deed across the table. Everyone stared at them like they were written in a foreign language. Renee grabbed one, read it. Her face went pale. That's impossible. Omari bought that house. Mr. Holloway shook his head gently. No, Diane purchased it. Omari's name isn't on any of the paperwork. Neither is yours. The property belongs solely to Diane. The room went silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes it hard to breathe. Omari looked at Diane. His eyes were wide, confused. Diane, what is this? What's going on? Mr. Holloway continued before Diane could answer. Furthermore, Diane has recently inherited the holdings of the Carver Industrial Trust. This includes factories, commercial real estate, offshore accounts, and various other assets. The total estimated value is $88 billion. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The number hung in the air like smoke. 88 billion. The words didn't even sound real. Gloria's voice was shaking when she finally spoke. There must be some kind of mistake. That's not possible. Mr. Holloway smiled, polite, professional. No mistake, ma'am. I've verified everything personally. Diane is the sole heir to the Carver fortune, one of the largest private inheritances in recent history. Shanice's hand slipped off Omari's leg. Her eyes darted between Diane and Mr. Holloway. She looked like she wanted to disappear, like she wanted to sink into the floor and never be seen again. Omari tried to speak. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He tried again. Diane, baby, wait. Let's talk about this. That's when Diane spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, cold as winter. I signed your papers, Omari. You're free, but you're also homeless. You have 48 hours to vacate my property. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer. Omari reached across the table. His hand was shaking. Diane, please, I made a mistake. I was wrong. We can fix this. Diane looked at his hand, looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small, didn't feel invisible. She felt powerful. She felt seen. Not because they finally noticed her, but because she finally noticed herself. I stayed silent because my grandmother taught me silence is strength, she said. You mistook my silence for weakness. That was your mistake. She reached into her purse and pulled out the signed divorce papers, the ones from Thanksgiving dinner. She placed them on the table in front of Omari. You wanted me gone. Now I'm gone. But everything you thought was yours, it's mine. The house, the cars, the furniture, all of it. Gloria stood up. Her voice was loud, desperate. You can't do this. We're family. Diane turned to her. You're right, we were family, but you celebrated my humiliation. You laughed when your son degraded me. You welcomed his mistress into my home. You treated me like I was nothing. She paused. Let the words sink in. So now I'm treating you the same way. You're all dismissed from my estate, effective immediately. She stood up, smoothed her suit, looked at each of them one last time. Omari looked broken. Gloria looked terrified. Renee looked sick. Shanice wouldn't even make eye contact. Diane picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Mr. Holloway held it open for her. As she passed him, she whispered, "Thank you," so quietly only he could hear. He nodded, smiled. "My pleasure, Mrs. Diane." She walked out of that office with her head high. The locket around her neck caught the sunlight coming through the window, and behind her, the family that once made her feel small sat in silence, drowning in the weight of their own cruelty. The next 48 hours were chaos. Omari tried everything. He called Diane. She didn't answer. He showed up at the mansion. Security turned him away. He sent flowers. She sent them back. He tried to get his lawyer involved. His lawyer told him there was nothing he could do. The property was Diane's. The divorce was final. He had no legal claim to anything. Shanice disappeared the moment the truth came out, blocked Omari's number, deleted him from social media, moved on like he never existed. 2 weeks later, Omari saw her at a restaurant. She was with another man, older, richer. She saw Omari looking and turned away, didn't even acknowledge him. That hurt worse than the divorce, worse than losing the house, because it proved what he'd always denied. She never loved him. She loved what she thought he had. Gloria and Renee faced their own consequences. Word spread fast in their social circle. The story of how they disrespected Diane, how they celebrated her humiliation, how they never knew she was the one with the power all along. Suddenly, invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. People they thought were friends started avoiding them. At church, the whispers followed them down the aisles. The looks of judgment, the quiet condemnation. They'd built their reputation on being better than everyone. And now everyone saw them for what they really were. Renee's husband, a quiet man who'd always treated Diane with kindness, filed for separation. He told her he couldn't be married to someone so cruel, someone who celebrated the suffering of others. Renee begged, pleaded, promised to change, but he was done. He'd seen who she really was, and he wanted no part of it. Omari's business collapsed completely. Without the mansion as collateral, without Diane's name backing him, investors pulled out. Partners walked away. Everything he'd built, everything he thought was his, crumbled. He moved into a small rental apartment, 1 bedroom, thin walls, nothing like the life he'd known. He spent his days alone, scrolling through old photos, wondering how he'd lost everything, wondering why he never appreciated what he had when he had it. Meanwhile, Diane became a ghost. She didn't do interviews, didn't post on social media, didn't make public appearances. She let her lawyers handle everything, let her silence speak louder than any words could. People talked about her, speculated, tried to figure out who she was. But Diane didn't care about any of that. She had something more important to do. She started a foundation, named it after Miss Lorraine, the Lorraine Foundation for Young Women. Its mission was simple: help young women from humble backgrounds get education, get opportunities, get a chance to build something real. Diane donated millions quietly, without press releases or photo ops. She just did the work, paid for scholarships, funded programs, built community centers in small southern towns like the one she grew up in. She helped people the way her grandmother would have wanted, the way her grandmother had helped her. She donated to Miss Lorraine's old church, paid off their mortgage, fixed their roof, bought new pews. The pastor cried when he found out, called Diane personally to thank her. Diane told him not to thank her, to thank Miss Lorraine, to remember the woman who cleaned houses and raised a grandchild and never once complained. To honor the woman who taught that silence was strength. Diane never spoke publicly about Omari or the divorce, never gave her side of the story, never tried to defend herself or make him look worse. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, and her silence, that same silence that Omari mistook for weakness, became legendary. People admired it, respected it, saw it for what it truly was. Not weakness, not defeat, but dignity, grace, power. 1 year after that Thanksgiving dinner, Diane stood in a cemetery in her hometown. The sun was setting. Orange and pink painted the sky. The air was warm, the kind of warm that feels like a hug. She wore a simple dress. Her hair was natural, no makeup, no fancy jewelry, just the locket. That same golden locket Miss Lorraine gave her all those years ago. She stood in front of her grandmother's grave. The headstone was simple, just a name and dates. But Diane had added something new, a quote, "Silence is strength. Love is eternal." She placed fresh flowers at the base. white roses, Miss Lorraine's favorite. She knelt down and touched the stone. Her fingers traced the letters of her grandmother's name. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I let God fight my battles just like you taught me." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She just let them fall, let them water the ground where the woman who raised her now rested. They thought I was weak because I didn't fight. They thought I was nothing because I stayed quiet. But you knew. You always knew. She stayed there for a long time, talking to a grave like it could hear her. Maybe it could. Maybe Miss Lorraine was somewhere listening, somewhere smiling, somewhere proud of the woman her granddaughter had become. When Diane finally stood up, she felt lighter, felt free. She walked through the cemetery and into town. Children playing in the street waved at her. She waved back. Elders sitting on porches nodded with respect. She nodded back. This town knew who she was now, knew what she'd done for them, knew she was one of them, and they loved her for never forgetting where she came from. She walked to Miss Lorraine's old house. It was still standing. Diane had bought it, had it restored, turned it into a community center, a place where young people could come, learn, grow, dream. She sat on the porch, the same porch where Miss Lorraine used to sit, where she used to hold Diane and hum hymns and teach her about life. Diane rocked in the old chair and sipped sweet tea. The sky turned dark. Stars came out. The world felt peaceful. In that moment, Diane wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a businesswoman, wasn't someone famous or powerful or important. She was just a woman who'd been hurt and healed, a woman who'd been broken and rebuilt, a woman who learned that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who hold all the power. And she was okay with that. More than okay, she was at peace. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. They mistake silence for defeat. They think that if you don't fight back, you're not strong. But real power doesn't announce itself. Real power doesn't need to be loud. Real power just is. It exists. It waits. And when the time is right, it shows itself in ways that change everything. Diane learned that lesson the hard way. Learned it from a grandmother who scrubbed floors and raised a child and never once raised her voice. Learned it from years of being invisible. Learned it from a marriage that broke her heart but couldn't break her spirit. And in the end, when everything was said and done, she realized that Miss Lorraine was right all along. Silence was strength. And God did fight her battles. She just had to be patient enough to let him. Diane held the locket in her hand, opened it, looked at the picture of Miss Lorraine, young, beautiful, full of dreams. She smiled, closed the locket, pressed it to her heart, and whispered into the night, "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." The stars above her seemed to shine brighter. The wind picked up, and somewhere, somehow, Diane felt her grandmother's presence, felt her love, felt her pride, and she knew. She knew that no matter what happened next, no matter where life took her, she would be okay. Because she came from strength. She carried strength. She was strength. And nobody could ever take that away from her.